Hello, and welcome to another Bond Buyer podcast. I'm John Hallacy, your host today, and with me is William Cox, who's with Kroll Bond Rating Agency. And Bill is a long-standing muni stalwart. He spent 21 years at another not-to-be-disclosed rating agency, 10 years in the private practice side of government, and he's been at Kroll 2 years. Welcome, Bill.
Great to be here, John. Thank you.
One of the things we're going to discuss today is rating ceilings and what they mean to the market and to Kroll's specific policy. I will say in my experience, I did a fair amount of work in sovereign and sub-sovereign credit way back when. And we always talked about the sovereign ceiling in those markets and how we could pierce the sovereign ceiling, and was there a way to do it? And of course, when you have the currency risk, whether it's local market or global market, we don't have that aspect. But, I thought your piece was particularly provocative in terms of, why should we accept this, notching approach? Should we just look at each case de novo and, go from the ground up on considering where the rating should be? Alternatively, the linkage, I think in your piece, you kind of propose that the linkage is a little stronger as you go down the rating scale.
Yes, indeed.
And it's a little different, lighter, when you go up the rating scale. So maybe you can just talk about all that for us.
Sure. That's a lot to cover, including your point, which I think, John, is a really good one, about sovereign ceilings. I know that's not our topic here, but our sovereign methodology actually addresses this issue in a similar way by articulating our position regarding the need to look at, even in situations like sub-sovereign debt, the fundamental features that may sometimes allow a credit inside a country to pierce the sovereign ceiling. But putting that aside, that is a really interesting topic. But our approach to the municipal market is similar to what you described, in that we believe that credits require a fundamental review from the ground up each time that they are in the market, and that review should include an analysis of whether or not a cap or an affiliation with a ceiling is necessary. With regard to the point that you raised about closer ties that a rating on a revenue bond might have to the underlying municipality when the credit is weak, the point we're trying to make in that part of the article is that if fundamentals are really, really weak, if there's a fundamental concern about affordability, for example, or the possibility of insolvency, then a municipality a municipal credit is behaving a bit more like a corporate credit, in that it could have real insolvency or liquidity risk, in which case we think the separation should be minimal.
Well, maybe backtracking a little bit, maybe we got into the weeds too fast, but what precipitated all of this? I mean, what was the rationale for kind of thinking through this case?
Yeah. There were three things, actually, that occurred this year. One is just the large number of inquiries we were getting from issuers, from financial advisors, and others who were saying that they wanted to be told where our approach to rating ceilings was. Lots of inbound calls.
Just that simple.
Yeah. What's your position on rating ceilings? And as we pushed further, after more than a few of these came in to the desks of our senior analysts, folks started to volunteer when we'd say, well, why is everybody asking this question? One thing was that there were some methodological changes or proposed changes at other rating agencies that were making people a little nervous about wanting to know what everyone's position was. Changes not always well received, I suppose. And second was the ruling by Judge Swain in the Puerto Rico Title III case that hit the market pretty hard on the topic of special revenues and how they may be treated in an insolvency.
In regards to COFINA.
So COFINA is a separate issue. The specific ruling in the late spring that got everyone upset was she ruled that the government did not have to continue making payments on what were universally accepted as special revenue bonds by the Highway and Transportation Authority unless the government wanted to. And that was fundamentally different than most market participants thought was possible. The historic treatment of special revenue bonds in legal analysis is that special revenue bonds would not be subject to the stay during a bankruptcy proceeding. In other words, governments would have to continue making payments till the issues got sorted out at the end of the bankruptcy, but they would not be automatically stopped. And Judge Swain basically said in her opinion that may be the case, but only if the government chooses to continue making the payments. No one can stop them from making the payments, but she ruled that she, as the judge in this situation, did not have the ability to force them to make the payments. That was a eye-opener for much of the market, including ourselves.
Well, certainly anytime you stay a payment, that's got a serious consequence. You say here it would be rare that legal structuring alone will merit higher ratings.
We say that in the section of the report dealing with underlying municipalities that are in severe stress. The case of a municipality that might literally be on the brink of insolvency, or wherein the revenues attempting to be pledged and securitized, for example, represent a disproportionate amount of the budget. In those situations, we don't believe that you can just sort of wrap it with some legal provisions, even if they are quite strong legal provisions elsewhere, and expect to get a lot of uplift in the rating, because the risks of what may occur during the insolvency that might be pending are too great to warrant that kind of separation.
So it's hard for structure to overwhelm the fundamentals, but I kind of go back to some of the cases where you had bailout bonds, where the GO rating was lower than the bailout bond. Now, I'm not saying your firm, but other firms rated the bailout bonds higher, and the GOs were not underwater, but were often below investment grade.
There are situations where there could be large separation. You could have BBB credits and the underlying municipality, the general obligation rating, and have AAA securities. So I wouldn't rule that out. But when you get below investment grade in the municipal market, as you know, it's a rare thing for a general government to be below investment grade. If you're, in our opinion, below investment grade, then there's really a case of very weak fundamentals or other dislocation that's occurring, usually in the economic base. So our thoughts on this topic are that those cases are exceptions. And to the extent that rating caps or ceilings are driven by a checklist approach, the rating on the GO is A, the rating on the revenue bond can't be higher than 2 or 3 notches, we believe that applies a logic that for the broad spectrum of municipal credits is irrelevant. And the reason it's irrelevant is because most municipalities, the great majority of municipalities would not be in the situation where those distinctions are warranted, i.e. bankruptcy, insolvency, or similar cases Title III in Puerto Rico.
I'm just kind of going back to some of the history a little bit, which in the case of Kroll maybe isn't fair, but like the PICA bonds with Philly, when Philly was kind of having some difficulties, and you did the PICA bonds and they were backed by the wage tax, and that took care of the immediate problem. I'm thinking to Washington, D.C. when they had the Oversight Board. Of course, New York City with MAC. So there were
the original.
Yeah, there were times when occasionally the bailout bond was rated higher than the GO entity. But I suppose your real premise is the notching is what's not. You shouldn't have like a standard notch approach to it.
Right. We believe that it's a case-by-case approach for a situation where you have low ratings and uplift, especially one where there might be really weak fundamentals. Then legals plus the point we make in the piece is you can't ignore the practical and pragmatic issues on the ground in the municipality. Mm-hmm. So those are important too, both at the low end of the rating spectrum and at the high end. For example, the legal protections result in the inability of a city to do anything else with bonds by state law. Then that's going to be a much stronger situation than a weak city merely developing and producing a bond indenture that says we promise that we're going to make these deposits to a trustee. And then everything in between, direct deposits from the collecting agent to the trustee, true sale, which is really what we think of as a securitization, meaning the revenues are actually sold to a bankruptcy remote entity. There are all sorts of things in between the broad spectrum of options, from a simple revenue bond with a bond indenture to just an overwhelmingly strong securitization package.
You know, what's interesting about this as well is it comes at a time when GOs have been stressed and strained and budgetarily constrained in some cases, and the buy side's kind of developed a preference for revenue bonds. Yeah. And now the premise for certain revenue bonds is being questioned. So, quote unquote, where are you safe?
Well, it's case by case. You've got to look at how you're secured. GO bonds are, for the most part, the equivalent of corporate unsecured credit. And you're making a bet that that unsecured credit is worth a certain amount of protection given the general obligation nature of the pledge. On the other hand, revenue bonds are secured, but how secure is secure depends a lot on both legal and practical protections.
Well, we've certainly discovered the unsecured GO status in the post-Detroit world. Tell me a little bit about stress scenarios. You make emphasis on that you put the revenue streams through stress scenarios within this context.
I can use a couple of examples. Say, for example, the Chicago South Tech Securitization Corporation, which is an example of something that, in our opinion, is truly securitized. There's small S securitization, which we often talk about in the municipal market, which is a highly protected revenue bond, and then we would call capital S securitization, where it's like an asset-backed security, in that the revenue stream has been sold. The revenue stream is protected legally in so many ways, and there are no options around it, we believe, even in a bankruptcy. Those kinds of transactions actually aren't very common in the municipal market, but STSC was one of them. In the world of asset-backed securitizations, that legal protection is only the first step. And it's a very rigorous process to establish whether or not that level of legal protection exists, i.e., does the sponsoring entity have any ownership of those revenues any longer? So once you're done that, then it comes down to this fundamental question about the revenue stream itself. Well, it's protected, but is it strong? Can it withstand economic stresses? Can it withstand political stresses? And what we mean there is that after we have established that legal protection, then we look at the revenue stream and say, well, what about the Great Recession? What about the Depression? What about name any other scenario? And we'll apply those stresses and then exaggerate them, magnify them to see if the revenue stream and the level of coverage that the revenue stream supports debt service requirements against can survive those stresses.
I just have to ask, in the period now, I forget when you put this out, but have you had some more inquiry based on this policy? I mean, more people have been approaching you to kind of sound you out on it?
Yeah, quite a bit. I think the piece itself has been read and circulated widely, more than sort of a piece you would think that's on such a dry topic. We have also
We're not dry in munis, are we?
Just some of us. We also, Karen Daly, who heads up our public finance department, has been on the road with a panel talking about this topic and the impact that this ruling has had on the perception of revenue bonds in the market. And those sessions have been sellout sessions. It's been pretty remarkable. We've done them in 3 cities, Boston, New York, and Chicago, and I believe there's one scheduled to be done in California sometime soon, and one in Texas coming up soon. Yeah, there's been a lot of attention to this topic and to this piece in those settings, which are close to the press, I'm sorry.
Well, we appreciate your thoughtfulness here, and hopefully it leads to some differentiation in the market. Is there anything we missed?
No, not at all, other than our belief is that you've got to do fundamental credit analysis from the bottoms up, and you need experience to do that. Experience matters a lot in situations like this.
Okay, Bill Cox, thank you for coming on the podcast
Thanks, John.
today.
Great to be here.
Thanks for listening to our show today.